So now I would ask that you join us in a spirit of meditation, reflection, or prayer as we deepen into our service. And I share our opening words this morning by Joan Javier Duval. You are beloved, and you are welcome here. Whether tears have fallen from your eyes this past week, or gleeful laughter has spilled out of your smiling mouth, you are beloved, and you are welcome here. Whether you're feeling brave or brokenhearted, defiant or defeated, fearsome or fearful, you are beloved, and you are welcome here. Whether you have untold stories buried deep inside, or stories that have been forced beyond the edges of comfort, you are beloved, and you are welcome here. Whether you have made promises, broken promises, or are renewing your promises, you are beloved, and you are welcome here. Whatever is on your heart, however it is with your soul in this moment, you are beloved, and you are welcome here. In this space of welcome and acceptance, commitment and recommitment, of covenant and connection, let us worship together. We are going to have a story for all ages, and Marcy, I'll turn to you for that.
A Bad Case of Stripes by David Shamp. Camilla Cream loved lima beans, but she never ate them. All of her friends hated lima beans, and she wanted to fit in. Camilla was always worried about what other people thought of her. Today, she was fretting even more than usual. It was the first day of school, and she couldn't decide what to wear. There were so many people to impress. She tried on 42 outfits, but none seemed quite right. She put on a pretty red dress and looked in the mirror. Then she screamed. Her mother ran into the room, and she screamed too. "Oh my heavens," she cried, "you're completely covered with stripes." This was certainly true. Camilla was striped from head to toe. She looked like a rainbow. Mrs. Cream felt Camilla's forehead. "Do you feel all right?" she asked. "I feel fine," Camilla answered. "But just look at me." "You get back in bed this instant," her mother ordered. "You're not going to school today." Camilla was relieved. She didn't want to miss the first day of school, but she was afraid of what the other kids would say, and she had no idea what to wear with those crazy stripes. That afternoon, Dr. Bumble came to examine Camilla. "Most extraordinary," he exclaimed. "I've never seen anything like it. Are you having any coughing, sneezing, runny nose, aches, pains, chills, hot flashes, dizziness, drowsiness, shortness of breath, or uncontrollable twitching?" "No," Camilla told him. "I feel fine." "Well then," Dr. Bumble said, turning to Mrs. Cream, "I don't see any reason why she shouldn't go to school tomorrow. Here's some ointment that should help clear up those stripes in a few days. If it doesn't, you know where to reach me." And off he went. The next day was a disaster. Everyone at school laughed at Camilla. They called her Camilla Crayon and Night of the Living Lollipop. She tried her best to act as if everything were normal, but when the class said the Pledge of Allegiance, her stripes turned red, white, and blue, and she broke out in stars. The other kids thought this was great. One yelled out, "Let's see some purple polka dots!" Sure enough, Camilla turned all purple polka dotty. Someone else shouted, "Checkerboard!" and a pattern of squares covered her skin. Soon, everyone was calling out different shapes and colors, and poor Camilla was changing faster than you can change channels on a TV. That night, Mr. Harms, the school principal, called. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Cream," he said. "I'm going to have to ask you to keep Camilla home from school. She's just too much of a distraction, and I've been getting calls from the other parents. They're afraid those stripes may be contagious." Camilla was so embarrassed. She couldn't believe that 2 days ago, everyone liked her. Now, nobody wanted to be in the same room with her. Her father tried to make her feel better. "Is there anything I can get for you, sweetheart?" he asked. "No, thank you," sighed Camilla. What she really wanted was a nice plate of lima beans, but she had been laughed at enough for one day. Well, yes, I see," Dr. Bumble mumbled when Mr. Cream phoned the next day. "I think I'd better bring in the specialists. We'll be right over." About an hour later, Dr. Bumble arrived with 4 people in long white coats. He introduced them to the Creams. "This is Dr. Gropp, Dr. Sponge, Dr. Cricket, and Dr. Young. Then the specialist went to work on Camilla. They squeezed and jabbed, tapped and tested. It was very uncomfortable. Well, it's not the mumps, concluded Dr. Grubb. Or the measles, said Dr. Sponge. Definitely not chickenpox, put in Dr. Cricket. Or sunburn, said Dr. Young. Try these, said the specialist. They each handed her a bottle filled with different colored pills. Take one of each before bed, said Dr. Gopp. Then they filed out the front door, followed by Dr. Bumble. That night, Camilla took her medicine. It was awful. When she woke up the next morning, she did feel different, but when she got dressed, her clothes didn't fit right. She looked in the mirror, and there, staring back at her, was a giant, multicolored pill with her face on it. Dr. Bumble rushed over as soon as Mrs. Cream called, but this time, instead of the specialists, he brought the experts. Dr. Gord and Dr. Mellon were the finest scientific minds in the land. Once again, Camilla was poked and prodded, looked at and listened to. The experts wrote down lots of numbers, then they huddled together and whispered. Dr. Gord finally spoke. It might be a virus, he announced with authority. Suddenly, fuzzy little virus balls appeared all over Camilla. Or possibly some form of bacteria, said Mr. Mellon. Out popped squiggly little bacteria trails. Or it could be a fungus, added Dr. Gord. Instantly, Camilla was covered with different colored fungus blotches. The experts looked at Camilla, then at each other. We need to go over these numbers again back at the lab, Dr. Gord explained. We'll call you when we know something. But the experts didn't have a clue, much less a cure. By now, the TV news had found out about Camilla. Reporters from every channel were outside her house telling the story of the bizarre case of the incredible changing kid. Soon, a huge crowd was camped out on the front lawn. The Creams were swamped with all kinds of remedies, from psychologists, allergists, herbalists, nutritionists, psychics, an old medicine man, a guru, and even a veterinarian. Each so-called cure only added to poor Camilla's strange appearance until it was hard to even recognize her. She sprouted roots and berries and crystals and feathers and long furry tail, but nothing worked. One day, a woman who called herself an environmental therapist claimed she could cure Camilla. Close your eyes, she said. Breathe deeply and become one with your room. I wish you hadn't said that, Camilla groaned. Slowly, she started to melt into the walls of her room. Her bed became her mouth, her nose was a dresser, and 2 paintings were her eyes. The therapist screamed and ran from the house. What are we going to do? Cried Mrs. Cream. It just keeps getting worse and worse. She began to sob. At that moment, Mr. Cream heard a quiet little knock at the front door. He opened it, and there stood an old woman who was just as plump and sweet as a strawberry. Excuse me, she said brightly, but I think I can help. She went into Camilla's room and looked around. My goodness, she said with a shake of her head. What we have here is a bad case of stripes, one of the worst I've ever seen. She pulled a container of small green beans from her bag. Here, she said, these might do the trick. Are those magic beans? Asked Mrs. Cream. Oh my, no, replied the kind old woman. There's no such thing. These are just plain old lima beans. I bet you'd like some, wouldn't you? She asked Camilla. Camilla wanted a big, heaping plateful of lima beans, more than just about anything, but she was still afraid to admit it. Yuck, she said. No one likes lima beans, especially me. Oh dear, the old woman said sadly. I guess I was wrong about you. She put the beans back in her bag and started toward the door. Camilla watched the old woman walk away. Those beans would taste so good, and being laughed at for eating them was nothing compared to what she'd been going through. She finally couldn't stand it. Wait, she cried. The truth is, I really love lima beans. I thought so, the old woman said with a smile. She took a handful of beans and popped them into Camilla's mouth. Said Camilla. Suddenly, the branches, feathers, and squiggly tails began to disappear. Then the whole room swirled around. When it stopped, there stood Camilla, and everything was back to normal. I'm cured, she shouted. Yes, said the old woman. I knew the real you was in there somewhere. She patted Camilla on the head. Then she went outside and vanished into the crowd. Afterward, Camilla wasn't quite the same. Some of the kids at school said she was weird, but she didn't care a bit. She ate all the lima beans she wanted, and she never had even a touch of the stripes again.
Steve Furtick, a Christian minister, once said, "The reason we struggle with insecurity is because we compare our behind the scenes with everybody else's highlight reel." We all do it. We all compare ourselves to others. It's natural and inevitable. And to an extent, it is even necessary and desirable. We are a people in relationship. We have built our family, our society, and our religion on that premise. Comparing ourselves to others helps us to know how to live together. People who can't understand norms of behavior struggle. Neurotypical and observant children learn to compare how they are behaving with how the group is behaving in different situations, and then they adjust accordingly. We have social compacts that facilitate a relatively peaceful shared life. Comparing yourselves to others is a tool that helps you to understand the world and your place in it. The difficulty arises when we give those comparisons undue power, when we value certain standards too highly. So I want to go in two directions with this. First, I want to look at our normative practices, and then I want to look at our individual lives. We, as Americans, have normative standards, and in this country, the norm is a white, cisgender, heterosexual, able-bodied male. What that means is that those characteristics are the best, the most desirable, and everyone else is compared to those traits with often unspoken understanding that other people have value only insofar as they can approximate those traits. Think about those standards one at a time and think about how many pejorative terms there are for people who are not those things. How many words for girls and women, for instance, are used to insult men? How many words about queer people are used as insults in general? How many derogatory words are there for people of color? These words betray a way of thinking. We just adopted a vision statement saying we are journeying towards radical inclusion. And I would posit that radical inclusion means dismantling some of our normative practices. It means creating a world where being a trans woman who loves other women and has brown skin will be as normative, as desirable as being the white hetero cis man in the congregation. Comparisons will not be made suggesting she is a lesser version of humanity or that she is other. She will have just as much power, influence, voice, and value as her white hetero cis male counterpart, which of course she does. She will see herself reflected in the symbols in our congregation and have a seat at the table. A test that people are given to see if we live in an equitable society is to imagine you'll be assigned a role in that society that you won't know in advance. If you harbor ideas about not wanting to be in a certain role, say an Indigenous person in Bismarck, because you know your life will be harder, then we do not have an equitable society. So that is the first scenario of unhealthy comparisons. We share responsibility for this undesirable hierarchy of value. Until we value all people equally and all people have access to power, comparisons to normative groups will continue to be unhealthy. Now I want to move into our individual experience with comparing ourselves to others. You may be so blessed that you were well loved, grew up with affirming messages, and find yourself to be a reasonably competent adult. If so, you might allow your mind to wander now and spend some time in gratitude for that. Many of us, however, are constantly fighting a sense of inadequacy that we feed by comparing ourselves to others. And of course, the others are always doing so much better than we are. We are taught this early, sometimes in our families, almost certainly in our schooling. The whole education system is set up to compare us with or against our peers, and against some nameless commission of bureaucrats' notion of where we should be in our development on the 11th Wednesday of the 3rd grade. Since there is no such thing as a perfect student, we all fall short by comparison. There are always other students who seem to be closer to being the perfect student. And we learn to value or discount our intelligence based on a flawed system that tells us if we are A smart or F smart. There's a popular story circulated amongst teachers that may have first been told in 1940 by George Revis, an assistant superintendent of the Cincinnati Public Schools. It goes like this. Once upon a time, the animals decided they must do something heroic to meet the problems of a new world, so they organized a school. They had adopted an activity curriculum consisting of running, climbing, swimming, and flying. And to make it easier to administer the curriculum, all the animals took all the subjects. The duck was excellent in swimming, in fact, better than the instructor. But he made only passing grades in flying and was very poor in running. Since he was slow in running, he had to stay after school and also drop swimming in order to practice running. And this was kept up until his webbed feet were badly worn, and he was only average in swimming. But average was acceptable in school, so nobody worried about that, except the duck. The rabbit started at the top of the class in running, but had a nervous breakdown because of so much makeup work in swimming. The squirrel was excellent in climbing until he developed frustration in the flying class, where his teacher made him start from the ground up instead of from the treetop down. He also developed a Charlie horse from overexertion and then got a C in climbing and a D in running. The eagle was a problem child and was disciplined severely. In the climbing class, he beat all the others to the top of the tree, but he insisted on using his own way to get there. At the end of the year, an abnormal eel who could swim exceedingly well and also run, climb, and fly a little had the highest average and was the valedictorian. The prairie dogs stayed out of school and fought the tax levy because the administration would not add digging and burrowing to the curriculum. They apprenticed their children to a badger and later joined the groundhogs and gophers to start a successful private school. So when my children were small, I volunteered in their classrooms. I was often assigned to work with the children who were struggling to learn to read. Some research shows that most children learn to read naturally between the ages of 4 and 11. Well, if you are the child that learns to read closer to 11 than 4, life in the public schools is hell. It broke my heart to see children, most often boys, in the 1st grade, comparing themselves to others and deciding they were stupid, a notion reinforced by the system. And that stays with a person. I'm firmly convinced that had they just been allowed to approach reading a year or two later, they would have been fine. Meanwhile, someone could have continued to read to them to instill a love of reading. It was a matter of maturation, not of intelligence or ability. One of my friends was asked by her 4th grade teacher how it felt to be the dumb one in her family. And up until that moment, that was not how she understood the world. And that nonsense stays with us for a long time and shapes how we show up in the world. Maybe you were labeled the dumb one or the homely one or the problem child in your family. It can be so hard to recognize those comparisons are not in fact empirical truth. They are more likely just nonsense. But having been set up to compare ourselves to others and found lacking, we go right on doing it as adults. And we give away so much power in the process. Not long ago on a Zoom meeting, I was on a Zoom meeting with about 150 ministers. The UUA put it together to help us to think through what we would do if there was terrible violence after the election. I was overwhelmed in thinking about how I would respond, how we would respond. I assumed that every other UU minister in America had a better handle on this. They had 2 ministers speak who were in what they called flashpoint areas. Violence had already arrived in their corner of the world. And I was prepared to compare myself to these experts and to find myself utterly lacking. One of the ministers told about how they had opened their church for the medics of the protest and opened their bathrooms. That's it? What? We could surely do that. My insecure comparing mind had built up what these wonder ministers were capable of. I was sure that they had the answers to ending violence in America with their deep wisdom, but they just opened the building. Our comparisons, when they are distorted, can paralyze us. How many things have you not reached for? Jobs, love, getting your needs met, because you allowed some absurd comparisons to stop you. Oh, I'm not qualified or experienced or as worthy as those imaginary people in my head. There is no point in even trying. We defeat ourselves before we even begin with bogus comparisons. And we can turn that on its head too. I am so different, so unlike any other person on the planet, that I am quite sure nobody can understand me. So I will protect myself and keep apart. One of our speakers last year referenced their own terminal uniqueness. They literally came close to dying from perceiving themselves as too one of a kind when they compared themselves to others. Sometimes we are the victims of comparisons and do ourselves an injustice by judging ourselves too harshly, either too inadequate or too special. And then sometimes we use comparisons to excuse ourselves from not living into our potential. Oh, I don't know anything about that. Let someone else take up the work. I see that a lot in congregations. I'm not an expert on technology or public speaking or finances or greeting. Let that imaginary person do the work. But I think the absolute worst thing about letting our unrealistic comparisons to others diminish us is that it robs everyone around you of your gifts. We create in our mind a standard that we measure ourselves against. Often we think somebody, real or imagined, embodies that standard. And of course, we do want standards. We want to keep stretching ourselves to grow and to be as wise and capable as we can be. Life would be boring if we had nothing left to learn. But again, we don't want to compare to the point that we douse our own light and find ourselves worthless. We don't want to compare to the point where we quash or suppress who we are, to the point we won't try anything new, to the point we censor and silence our authentic selves. The metaphor that comes to mind is potatoes, and I admit that might be a bit of a reach. But there are about 5,000 cultivated and 200 wild species of potatoes, not to mention subspecies. Yet in the United States, almost 70% of the potatoes grown in the top potato growing states are one of 4 kinds of russets. They make good French fries, and the fast food industry is a huge and steady market. But if you grow one crop to the exclusion of all the others, you make yourself vulnerable. Ask Ireland. One disease can sweep through and devastate an enormous chunk of our food resources. Also, as humans prioritize cultivated crops, as North Dakota does, over the land races or wild species, we lose more and more of the land races, taking important genetic diversity with them. Genetic diversity that might benefit humans down the line with better resistance or cures to diseases. Of course, the diversity might also benefit non-human animals, and plant species have a value in their own right. Not everything is about us. But if we compare every potato to a russet and hold up French fries as the only desirable outcome of being a potato, we miss so much. We might never know the delicious buttery flavor of another potato or the beauty of a purple potato because we have created a false standard of perfection. When we compare too much, we back ourselves into a corner. There is only one way to be a good mother or employee or partner or Unitarian Universalist or singer, and I am not that one way, so I must be inadequate. And then we either quit or we try to pretend that we are something we are not. Either way, the world misses out on our gifts. It misses out on other equally desirable ways of being and problem solving. I come to many committee meetings in this congregation with an idea about how I want to do something. I put my idea down on the table. And you all could decide that the minister is the person to compare yourself to and assume that she knows best. Fortunately for all of us, that rarely happens. Instead, you take my ideas as well as your own and turn them over and mash them up and build on them or reject them or alter them. And in the end, we have a much better outcome. But it takes all of our perspectives to get there. Each of us has a unique way of perceiving and understanding the world, a particular set of experiences. And when we put our heads together, we collectively create a much more robust and beautiful reality. But in order for that to work, you have to bring your authentic voice to the table. It does us no good for you to pretend to be something you are not or to hide. So if you are not fine, if you don't agree, if you understand things differently, if you get something that nobody else is getting, you have to share. You have to bring you to the table. Remember the words we heard a few weeks ago from the novelist Anna Quindlen? The thing that is really hard and really amazing is giving up on being perfect and beginning the work of becoming yourself. The reason we need you to be yourself and to be authentic and to quit comparing yourself to everybody else is that you are precisely who we need. We need your gifts, your perspective, your unique purple potato self. You are already good enough. You are already wise. You already have everything you need to show up in the world and be amazing. And you are carrying a way of knowing that is wholly unique to you and might be exactly the missing piece that we all need. So as the old adage goes, be yourself, everyone else is taken. So we'll extinguish our chalices now with words by the novelist John Green, and then enjoy one more beautiful piece of music by Alicia. So still your mind and enjoy that. And after the music, we'll break out into our virtual coffee hour groups. I don't know a perfect person. I only know flawed people who are still worth loving.
Come your days bring, come and cheer our spirits by your presence here. And on in every broken soul as vision that can see the whole. Rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel shall come within as light to dwell. Oh, come you wisdom from on high, from depths that hide within us sight, to temper knowledge with our care, to render every act a prayer. Rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel shall come within as hope to dwell. Rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel shall come